South, southern corner, southeast.
Okay. Can you arrange to get us on that one?
No, that's something you guys will have to work with LESC to do.
Okay.
I would suggest, two things. If this isn't enough time since this group has just started, to think about October or November, and you might want to reach out to Senator Sapien to see what, when he thinks he'd like to have you guys on. Traveling down to Hobbs, it's not central. There won't be great participation. And once you get back up to Santa Fe, October, November, those are webcast, those hearings.
Okay.
So there's bigger distribution, statewide access, I guess I should say. You can listen to those on the webcasting.
Oh, that's wonderful. I didn't know that.
Yeah.
So
I think if I were you guys, I would, memorials are memorials, and so they don't carry the force of law.
Right.
And what that means, it has a date, but there's no, most memorials get ignored. And whether they're signed or not, folks don't do them. And so I think it's great that you guys are doing this. It needs to be done, but my suggestion is do it right, do it thoroughly, and the amount of time you need to spend collecting data and having a comprehensive report rather than trying to sort of shotgun something through and get it done by an August 15th deadline.
Okay, thank you.
Really, the legislature probably needs information, I would say, by November. So if you think about when the public education budget hearing and the higher education budget hearings are, and we start talking about budget, if there are recommendations dealing with that, Tracy and I make staff recommendations to LFC in December. So having a report done in November is probably, for me, I think is the best timeline.
Oh, okay. So you're saying that not getting it done in August is fine as long as we have as long as I've made arrangements with the LESC about when we will be heard, and then if we get it to them before that a little bit, that'll be fine.
Yeah, I mean, they're not going to put you on their August agenda because we've got a joint agenda, and that agenda is already, and there's not any space. I think we're probably actually going to be running late on all 3 days. There's not space to put anything in. So if their deadline for having a report presented to the committee is, the earliest they're going to have it reported is September, staff will probably want time to review it so that they can do a staff brief and some information. But I don't think you guys should be working under the impression that this is going to be heard in August. Okay,
excellent.
And should request probably October or November, I would think, because you'll be centrally located.
Okay, and
that's just my personal 2 cents. So it may be worth something, it may not.
Is Michael in the room?
Yes.
Michael, did you hear back from Travis at the LESC? Do you know if he's planning to be here?
I sent him the reminder. He responded back and said thank you, but I did not get a RSVP or a confirmation of him showing up.
Okay.
Travis is in Sacramento this week.
Oh, so he may not have time.
So he won't be. He's doing a legislative staff management institute up there, and that's an intensive 8 to 5 every day. So he won't be.
Okay.
I'm guessing he won't be calling in.
Okay, that's fine.
Can you hear me now?
Is that Mona Lee?
Yes, I can hear myself.
Hi, Mona Lee.
Hi, Mona Lee. Are you there, Mona?
Morning, Mona Lee.
I could hear her, now I can't.
I'm sure she's still working off the bugs on her side.
Tina, are you there?
I'm here. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yep, Tina, you're good. Mona Lee disappeared, it seems. I mean, she's visible but not audible.
Right.
Oh, Loretta's name got on there. Good.
The agenda's right here next to you.
Well, I dialed in, but now I'm trying to go through the
Francis.
computer.
Oh, Francis has got it.
If you want her to put it up, we'll just say throw it up.
Hey, Michael, is there an agenda for today's meeting?
There certainly is. Francis, can you go ahead and throw up the agenda on your side, please?
Okay. Makes me nervous. Puts me in charge, doesn't it?
Michael says you
There
are.
it is. Can you see it?
No.
I don't. You can't see it?
Nope.
1 second. 1 second.
Oh.
Francis, you got to click OK on your side.
Show my screen. Gotcha. Now, I'm going to
There it is.
There you go.
make that little thing little, and I'm going to change the view to 2 pages. Will that work?
Hopefully.
Let's try it. I can't. It isn't seeming to listen to me. Oh, there is 1 page. Come on, 2 pages, baby.
Is your document 2 pages?
Oh, yes. Oh, except it doesn't look like it is anymore. This must be it.
So I can't even see this on my screen. I mean, it's so little. Can you just email it?
Michael,
Yep.
would you do that? Because you have an email list. Thanks.
Sure.
Thank
Um,
you.
Hello.
Can you see it a little better now?
Yeah, I can. It's not the whole thing. And so when you blow it up, you get, and I think you can see it. You don't have the whole page there.
No, I don't.
So if I can just print one, that'll.
Let me. That helps a bit.
That's probably good for now, Francis.
Pardon?
That's probably good for now. We can see everything up to next steps.
Yeah, that's all right for now. So, anything people found out that's... Oh, we aren't starting yet, huh?
No, we're ready.
Okay. So the first thing is anything people found out that we need to know at this meeting, you know, information-wise. Like, Terry, you found out that it looks like we should spend about $300,000 a year on professional development, for example.
Yeah, I mean, we're talking about having a state coordinator who does that, but also the costs of having a system in place. Most of the states around us have some sort of a professional development center and system in place, and that includes bringing in outside trainers, some of which are very expensive but seem very, very competent, and regional trainings and things along those lines. So yeah, about $300,000 is what we should be spending.
Okay, we will figure out how to do that, and that's really, I think, not part of this working group, except to know that it costs about that.
Yeah.
But it's part of your professional development committee work. We'll get that together.
Yeah.
Anything else from anybody?
Francis, this is Loretta.
So
I've been looking at other states and how they're funded for adult ed. It seems to me that performance funding has been part of the conversation for a while, like 10 years. So I haven't had a lot of time to look at a lot of the different states, but I do have some resources that I've found just by Googling funding and performance funding for adult ed, and I'd like to summarize it and maybe send it out to the group later.
Okay, could I, sorry, I'm very near some Harleys. Can you hear them?
No.
Good. Okay. Now, Loretta, we do have a version of performance-based funding in this state,
Right.
which we use to allocate the money to sub-grantees.
Mm-hmm.
When you talk about other states' performance-based funding, is it for that purpose, or is it for decision-making by the legislature about how much money they give the programs to reallocate? Which way?
I think both.
Okay.
See, it seems like in some states, I know we're doing 80-20, and some states, I looked at like Rhode Island's model, they're gradually increasing performance funding for this purpose over the next 3 to 4 years. So I don't know if that's something that we're looking at thinking about or proposing, or if that's a model that would work for New Mexico.
Yeah, I know that at this point in New Mexico, we are still committed to having a performance component, you know, and right now it's gone, we began at 5%,
Mm-hmm.
and we have been increasing it. Now it's 20.
Right.
We have a task force, a funding task force, which we've made into a standing committee now, so that we're thinking about this all year, every year, to try to make this work better. And so we'll be looking certainly at our reallocation, our sub-grantee allocation. And that's the second thing under full workload that I'm whatever the legislature bases its appropriation on, I think it's important that it allow us to determine our sub-allocation formula.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't think any legislators, well, that's not true, I'm sure, but I haven't found a legislature in the country that micromanages the sub-allocations.
No, and I'm guessing the legislature isn't interested in micromanaging
I am too.
of grantees.
So we do know they're interested in defining the full workload.
Mm-hmm.
And I couldn't tell if that means that's the sole basis that they want to fund us on, or if they want to consider other factors. And we can talk about that later too, under full funding, the next piece of the agenda.
Francis, can I ask a quick question before we get into the agenda?
Yeah.
At LESC, over the last 3 days, it was mentioned by PED that PED and HED are entering into an MOU for the GED and some adult basic ed stuff. Do you guys know anything about that?
I do, and I can tell you that they were planning on doing that, and I can tell you that HED sort of, as far as I know, is no longer working on it because PED was offering a position and a person in that position as part of the MOU, and only offering to pay 25% of that person who is an actual person, not just a position,
right,
of that salary. And that was not satisfactory to HED, apparently.
Okay.
And so, to my knowledge, but it's entirely possible things are taking, discussions taking place without me. But to my knowledge, that discussion is at a standstill at the moment.
Okay.
from the adult education point of view, that would be excellent to have that happen.
Okay. Thank you.
Francis, hit the third one down. The last one.
Check that.
Yep.
Keep the current one and don't show it. Thank you. Are there other questions? I see we have 7 attendees, actually more probably, because they're sharing rooms.
Yeah, I've got Nathan here and Lisa from UNMLA. And Lisa from UNMLA here in Michael's home.
Excellent. Okay. So is it okay if we begin with the agenda?
Sure.
We got that we need to spend $300,000 a year probably on professional development. Any other reporting people have of things they've found out?
Francis, do you remember what kinds of things were being looked for?
Yeah, it's on my desk next door to you, sorry. But when people who have done some research, I'm sure that it will also come up in the discussion that we can start on now, if that's okay with everyone. Okay, so the definition.
Unmuted too, so everyone can speak freely.
Okay, good. So the full workload, we are defining it inside our subgrantee funding formula as 40 hours or more of instruction or fewer than 40 hours and attained a GED. That's how we currently define a full workload. And I personally can't think of another way to do it. So I'm suggesting that we think in terms of that right now unless something else comes up as a better way.
I think that's fine, Francis. I think that that's worked, and you had pretty good consensus at least amongst the directors that was a good idea.
And that it's a pretty good definition of a workload. Now, the people who are not in the ABE community, the adult education community, don't work in it, you need to know that defining it that way, there really is in every program a larger workload than that. Because there are, I would guess, about half of their students don't reach 40 hours, but they teach them anyway for less than that. So to compute,
I have no idea why.
Hi, Mona Lee.
hi, Molly.
I'm sorry, guys. I had a technical problem. Thank you. I'll put myself back on mute.
So I know that if we call 40 hours the equivalent of an FTE, what we might want to do is look at total, for the purpose of this report, look at total number of hours of instruction and divide it by 40, much as the higher education institutions do by dividing it by 12 or whatever their definition of full-time is. So that if you have 3 students whose number of instructional hours total 40 altogether, they count as 1 FTE. Does that make sense to people for the purpose of this report?
As opposed to just those students who make 40 hours, Francis?
Yes, yes, because the other students are part of the workload,
They are, but if one of our goals in using the 40 hours was to try to reduce attrition.
Yes, but that is, remember that we're using it that way in our funding formula for the programs. to incentivize attrition reduction. Our goal the goal of the legislature is to provide full funding so we can do our job.
So do you think if you divide the number of hours by 40, we'll end up with higher numbers for each program?
Yes, we definitely will.
So
No,
I
no
think
question.
you need to set a threshold on that. If you think about public education funding,
Mm-hmm.
you need to find a qualified student as somebody going half-time at least in order to be eligible for funding. I think while the legislature is interested in, in fully funding the program, and this memorial gets to that, they're also not interested in funding people who show up but don't ever finish, if that makes sense.
Right, and so there's
you've got to have a balance between those two.
There is a threshold that's set by the feds for us, which is 12 hours. And if, so they don't count a student unless they have at least 12 contact hours. So it could be between 12 and 40, or we could use the threshold as 12, as the feds do.
Do you think it's a good idea to have two separate ways of doing it, though? Does it matter that we do it differently from the funding formula?
No, it does not matter I don't think, because our funding formula has a slightly different purpose. But when we use performance as an element, because we're trying to improve performance, and that includes improving retention, we need to incentivize those things in the formula. So that if we got funded based on 12 hours, say the federal threshold, by the state, we would still distribute it based on what we decide works in the funding formula to incentivize where the programs need to go. There's nothing wrong with doing that in my mind.
Yeah, and I think I would set that threshold a little bit higher.
Okay.
I would set it at least half-time. And so for my education, can you tell, this contact hours, is that how many hours we expect? Explain that to me real quick.
Okay, the reason, for us, first of all, the concept of full-time and half-time doesn't work well with adult students, and it doesn't work because some of them have a greater intensity of instruction. There are students who, at some programs, attend 15 hours a week, and some who attend 2 hours a week in the evenings. 40 was a number chosen because we use student assessment instruments that are approved by the American Institutes for Research and the National Reporting System for Adult Education. Those assessments have rules about how many class hours students should have before they get a post-test between the first test and the second test. 40 is the minimum when you look at all the publishers of the tests we can use. Mm-hmm. And so we can't post-test a student, except under exceptional circumstances, and there are some, before they've been there 40 hours. So generally speaking, we can't even know if they've made progress as the feds measure it until they've been there 40 hours. So that's why we chose that number.
Right.
Because when we talk to our programs and we're trying to provide technical assistance, retention is always an issue because adult students have lives that get in the way, and what they're always talking about is how to improve what they do or change what they do to be able to keep students long enough to post-test them. So we know that that's a major issue for us, and we use 40 in our funding formula for them to encourage them to continue working on that issue. So that's kind of as close as we can get to saying full-time or part-time.
Right, and I mean, I guess so. So if 40 hours is the threshold, we want to be funding. The legislature is going to want to be funding students that are enrolled and completing.
Okay.
So I'm not. I
There's
guess I don't know enough to know how the 12 hours and the 40 hours relates to that. But
okay, if they want to look at completing, there's also another way we can do it. You have looked at our NRS tables, I know, haven't you?
no.
And table 4 tells us how many instructional hours everybody's had at each level and what % made a level gain. Table 4B only looks at the students who actually post-tested and then tells you how many of those made a level gain. Now that's another way the legislature could look at it, that they could define completion as getting to a post-test.
Mm-hmm.
Or they could define completion as getting to a post-test or getting a job or getting a GED or transition to college. They could take all of that into account if they wish. We do when we fund the sub-grantees. We take all of that into account.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I don't know what the best way to do it is, and I don't know a lot. I don't have a lot of contact with adult basic ed, so I don't have a lot of knowledge about it. But I think I understand that you guys educate adults that show up that may not complete, quote unquote, or make gains, but there's got to be a balance between giving you guys enough money to do what you want to do, but also incentivizing the right things, and that is getting adults where we need to get them to.
Right, and we also have the issue that we have adults who life happens, they stop out for a while and they come back.
Right.
That's fairly commonplace. So I think what I'm hearing, first of all, a major thing I'm hearing is that we need to spend some time, maybe in an appendix, explaining various choices for defining full workload and offering several choices, and so that the legislators can understand what each choice might mean.
But if we do that, Frances, then doesn't that delay everything? Shouldn't we tell them what we're defining it as and just say this is what we decided as a committee to define a full workload as?
I don't think so, but I have not been involved in doing a report to a legislature before, and my feeling is that the purpose of our report is to educate them so that they can legislate what they think is best based on information we give them. Am I off about that?
I don't think I would give them too many choices. The more choices you give, the more confusion you create. And so I think, I mean, I guess I just suggest when you look at what higher ed has done in performance funding, and I think about what we do in terms of program evaluations and taxpayer dollars and being good fiscal agents and of taxpayer dollars, you don't want to be throwing money out there that's not having a positive effect in getting you where you want to be. So how do you recommend something to the legislature that, again, accounts for the cost you guys have of running these programs, but also doesn't necessarily fully fund all of the folks that aren't showing up? And so maybe that means there's a base funding part and a performance funding part, sort of, like was mentioned about the performance funding before we started. And so you've got an 80% on base, and then this portion that's at risk based on who's actually meeting these benchmarks. And so I can't define that well, again, because I don't know what those benchmarks are. I don't know enough about what you guys do, and so I'm sorry that I'm
okay.
interjecting myself, but
that's wonderful. I appreciate that, Rachel. So now
Okay.
I'm hearing that what we need to do is probably I need to lead a subgroup of people involved in adult education to come up with a few good, solid explanations for a few options that support prudent taxpayer money spending and all that, to offer to this work group so it decides on a single or a couple of options to present in the report. Does that make sense to you?
To me, I think that's a good idea. And then maybe you and I can have an offline conversation about, and I don't want to take up too much time of this group, but to bring me, I listened in on the last meeting, but I was sort of in and out, but to bring me up to speed on some of this stuff.
Okay. So we will use your expertise in chatting with legislators and knowing what they need and what they can handle, and provide our expertise about the meaning of various definitions of full workload.
Perfect.
Okay. So we'll do that. So now can we move on to the question of full funding? Because I had some questions that I put on the agenda about what that might mean or not mean, full funding as opposed to full workload. And one of the things that is important, I think, is that right now any state appropriation for adult education is actually not a line item in House Bill 2. It becomes a part of the NMHED operating budget. And in fact, there exists by statute an adult basic education fund. So could that, whatever the funding turns out to be, could it be appropriated to that fund instead of to the operating budget of the agency? So it would be a line item in House Bill 2?
So it depends on what, that's a typical lawyer answer. It depends. I don't have access to statutes right now. I'm on a computer that is not mine because mine's being re-imaged, so I can't pull that up, but it would depend on what the purposes of the fund are. So you have to look and see, you know, what the purpose of that fund is. I will tell you that, you know, funds are continuing appropriations, and the legislature doesn't necessarily like to appropriate the funds because generally they are non-reverting, and money that you don't spend piles up.
I think it might be reverting, but I'm not sure. I'll look at it.
Do you know what the statutory citation is?
Nope, I'm sorry, I don't have it where I am right now. I'm in a motel room, and I can't figure out how to get to it without losing this meeting.
Okay,
so
I'm going to walk out of my office and go grab a hard copy of statutes.
Okay. It's good she's doing that because we're coming up on another statute that's the instructional materials one she might want to look at.
Francis, is the statute going to help us determine where to put the money, or is it going to help us try to determine how to determine the money?
You mean seeing the Adult Basic Education Fund statute?
Yeah.
It'll tell us whether it's possible and suggest whether it's a good idea or a bad idea to appropriate the funding directly there. And it will suggest probably to Rachel a likelihood of whether or not the legislature would be willing to do that.
And I'm back. I just walked back in here.
Cool. Thank you.
I'm trying to see if I can't locate that section. And it's going to take me a while, so you don't want to wait for me to do this.
Okay, but that is a question, and I was just explaining to Terry that the reason you're looking at the statute is to determine whether or not that it can be appropriated there as a line item, whether or not it would be useful to do that, and how likely the legislature would be to even want to do it, right?
So it can be done. Just about anything can be done. We internally manage the General Appropriation Act and draft it.
Mm-hmm.
And so because it's not been done before doesn't mean it can't be done in the future, and I think we could figure out a way to do that. And I understand, you know, we put money in and we expect it to go to adult basic ed, and I think sometimes not everything does.
Yeah.
And there's when it goes into the larger budget, the HED budget, it's not, we intend something to go to adult basic ed, and HED has the authority to say, yes, we want it going there, or no, we don't.
Right.
In terms of how they budget.
So while you're doing that, I need to point out to the people who don't know this that there is a separate statute that I don't remember the name of, that is the state's required to have by federal law, that determines how the state will distribute oil and gas lease money that it gets from the feds. And that statute says that it will give a certain amount of that oil and gas lease money to PED to distribute for instructional materials, and that PED is to distribute a certain amount of that to adult education for instructional materials.
So you're talking about the Federal Mineral Land Leasing Act funds?
That's
Is
it.
that?
Yeah.
Okay. And those, so.
And the only reason I brought it up, Rachel, is because at this point, and it counts, PED distributes it to its schools based on FTEs.
Right, and you guys get a 0.25 FTE.
Pardon?
You guys get 0.25 of what public schools get.
I can't, that was garbled.
You guys get a quarter.
And they allocate it to us at 25% of how many students we have with 12 or more contact hours.
Yeah, that's in the public education in chapter 22, probably 22.
I'm being told my audio is lost.
Oh, we can still hear you.
Yeah, I can
Can you
still
not
hear
hear
you.
us, Francis?
I can't really hear you all.
Okay. Can you, is it garbled, Francis?
Sorry, come on, Scarlett.
She's probably calling in.
Hi, Michael.
Hey, so you can either, if you lost connection, either follow back to your email and re-click the link and sign back on, or you can just try to talk and we'll talk through the phone.
Oh, I hear you now. I heard you a minute. Okay, I will.
Try to continue without the phone and we'll see what happens. I'll call you right back if it's terrible.
Okay, so I'm continuing without my phone.
No, it's good. It's good. We can hear you. It's good.
We can hear you.
I can hear you. So the only reason I brought that up, that allocation for instructional materials, is that the legislature had set us at 0.25 FTE for our students with 12 or more contact hours.
Yeah, and I'm aware of that. So the statute for the Adult Basic Education Fund is Section 21.127.5, and it basically 21.127.5.
27.5. Okay, thanks.
It says money in the fund is appropriated to the Commission on Higher Education Department, for the purpose of funding adult basic education programs for educationally disadvantaged adults. Shall be distributed by the Commission pursuant to an equitable formula established by the Department in consultation with representatives from the Adult Basic Education Administrative sites. And it is a reverting fund. So anything left at the end of the year reverts back to the general fund. So that may be, you are right, that may be a way to carve out the appropriation for adult basic ed, still go through the higher ed budget, but deposit it into that fund so it's earmarked specifically for adult basic ed.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking. That maybe
so for your purposes, I think that's a good recommendation. That the money that goes into the fund, likely the way it's written, cannot be maintained by the department to pay for staff. So you have to think about that. The money that goes to the fund is to be distributed based on a formula to serve adult basic ed students.
And that's
so
right now what we do is we're to use a certain portion of our federal funding for state staff.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's how we do it. We're used to taking all the state funding and running it through our formula and giving it all out to the programs. They get every penny of that.
Yeah, then I think that's probably a good for you guys, and for ensuring that it goes to adult basic ed. It's probably a good recommendation coming out of this group that appropriations be made to that fund.
Okay, so that we've got a recommendation that we kind of know what it is.
It's always good to know what we're talking about.
I'm hoping, yeah. So the other statutory site that you have mentioned was the instructional materials. Let's see, the instructional, I'm doing this all on paper and not on a computer, and so you have to bear with me here. There. I'm not seeing, there's an instructional materials fund. I don't know why I'm not seeing it, but I'm not seeing it. Doesn't mean it's not here.
And I know that there are some regs regarding it, and I could find those later. But I know that this report doesn't have to address that. That was just an example. And I can't remember if the 0.25...
No, it is. It's 25%.
Yeah, okay.
You were
That's
right.
in statute?
It's in statute.
Okay.
Let's see if I can't find it. Statute basically says adult basic ed gets 25% per FTE what public ed gets for an FTE.
Okay. So that's just an example of something the legislature did decide counted as an FTE at one point.
Yeah. 20.
Now, does that mathematically translate to 48 hours would be one whole FTE?
I don't know how. So basically, the way it's funded in public ed is based on membership, and membership is defined as a qualified student who is a student that attends at least half time. And so that, and then they say and I think you'd have to go to regulations that for adult basic ed, and I'm almost there. I think I've got it in my hand now. It's 20, where's the fund? 2215.9 is how the fund is to be distributed. And so a school district's entitlement is based on 40-day membership. So whoever's enrolled as a qualified student on the 40th day, that's how they fund. And so they have to be attending at least part-time. I'm not sure how PED defines FTE. Let's see, the allocation for adult basic education shall be based on full-time equivalency obtained by multiplying the previous year's enrollment by 0.25. So you guys are based on prior year funding.
Yeah, we have to be because we don't have data at the right time, you know?
Right. And so I'm not sure how they define full-time equivalency, how PED does. And I can't pull up regs right now. Generally this would be really easy for me to do, but because I don't have my computer, I can't.
Okay, but what you're saying is that it does perhaps make some sense to look at how they define it and figure out if that's relatable in some way to adult ed.
Yeah, I mean, I guess when I look at the when I look at the memorial, and you know, it's talking about let's talk about funding, what it costs to provide a program. I think it's starting from the standpoint of what do instructional materials cost per student, and then trying to figure out, you know, again, how you account for funding instructional materials for, you know, having that reasonable, we're funding instructional materials for people that are showing up, and creating a distribution mechanism that addresses that. So to me, the first question is, well, how much, is 0.25 enough or not enough? What do instructional materials cost?
Okay, that's for instructional materials. Should we also need to look at how much does it just cost to
Yeah. I mean, I think both
students, like okay, so we will, between now and the next meeting, my office will agree to somehow arrange to compute the costs per student, including instructional costs, instructional materials costs, professional development costs, that kind of thing, right?
Yeah.
Because they'll want to know.
Of fully funding the formula for adult education programs. I mean, I think the first question is, so what does a fully funded program look like?
Well, part of that,
yeah,
Francis, isn't, if the cost surveys were all filled out the same way, you'd probably already have that information, but it might mean going to each program and saying, what does it actually cost to run this program? But you have to define the difference between cash additional costs and in-kind costs, like building space.
Yeah, the cost surveys are only supposed to report to us in kind. Now, Rachel, would that be of interest to them also? The in-kind contribution?
So do the federal regs require in-kind?
No.
I missed a part of what was just said.
The federal regs do not require in-kind contributions. They do.
And they don't require reporting on in-kind.
Pardon?
They don't require reporting on it either?
No, they require us to report contributions by state and local government. They do not require at this point that include in-kind contributions. But if the cash contributions have fallen below the maintenance of effort requirement in your state,
You can count the in-kind.
yeah, to keep from losing federal funding.
Okay.
Now, we got to keep in mind while we're talking about this that the Workforce Investment Act right now is awaiting the President's signature for a reauthorization to be called Workforce
Investment Opportunity Act.
Yeah, not investment, innovation and opportunity.
Yeah, there you go.
And there will be some changes, I'm sure, in requirements there. But we don't know yet what they'll be, and they won't occur for a couple of years.
So, Francis, this is Loretta, and looking at the cost of the programs, I think it is important to keep the in-kind as part of the picture, maybe separate that from our cash contributions and the funds that flow through the feds and the states. But I think it's important to show all the contributions.
Okay. I do too. We've started to show it on our annual fact sheet that we give everybody, especially the legislature. We've started to count that. Now, okay. So that's going to help us define full funding.
Yeah, I mean, if I look at page 3 of the memorial and it says the work group compiled data on the need for adult education services, base funding cost per program, cost per student served, and performance-based funding incentives, it's, to me, if we're trying to get at what does it cost to provide adult basic education, and then what would it cost to provide it to everybody in New Mexico who needed it? Those are two sort of different questions.
Yeah, they are.
As we start looking at statutes and making recommendations, do we think this is right? Do we think this is wrong? Should we be putting money here or there? I think you need to answer the funding questions first, and then look at, okay, so maybe the instructional materials piece is okay if you put more in HED's budget. Maybe it's not.
Yeah, I didn't really bring that instructional materials statute up to debate it, you know.
Okay.
But because that's
Gotcha.
another.
I say that I know Representative Mira, who I think is he the sponsor on this.
Yes.
He's been concerned. He and I have had conversations for 2 years about the amount of funding that goes to adult basic education in terms of that instructional materials piece. So yeah. I don't mean to put words in your mouth. He's mentioned those concerns.
Yeah, and we do have those concerns. I mean, what we end up getting is from $8 to $12 per student per year to buy instructional materials. You know, it's sort of not very helpful. It means our students have to share things a lot, and it makes it, you know, and it affects pedagogy for us. That is important. I just didn't want to distract us too much from this issue because, you know, it affects pedagogy in the sense that they can't, it's hard to give them homework, for example. And the odd thing is that an awful lot of our students really want homework. Ask for it, you know. Okay, so then, to determine full funding, we're going to find cost per student and per program, and we're going to look at every contribution that we currently get and say which is what. Like, this much is spent on instructional materials because the programs cannot limit their expenditures on instructional materials to what they get from that particular fund, of course, you know. And we'll include costs for instruction, and we'll include in-kind things and specify which is what. Is that what you think we need?
Yeah, I think so.
Okay.
I mean, to me, it seems like you lay out sort of the lay of the land in this report to the legislature. Here's what things look like, and then make some recommendations related to that. So you know, your funding going into the fund? Do we think that this is enough per program, or, you know, here's what we're spending now, but we're not able to do what we need to do. We think X amount more per student would be helpful, those types of things.
Right. Okay. So now this is making me question some of my questions in the next bullet, which is annual adjustment. When they talk about that, it sounds as though the intention of this memorial is really just to base it on the full workload and full funding requirements, rather than the thing that's under my second sub-bullet there, like state economic need, education need, K-12 dropout rate, or performance measures. We don't want to maybe have the legislature have to, that means they have to come up with a big fat formula.
Yeah, I mean, I think you don't want to make this more difficult than it needs to be.
Plus,
Okay.
Francis, you're already using performance when you allocate to the programs themselves, so maybe it's not necessary that the actual, this level of funding address it.
Yeah, I think that's right. So that's going to be the answer to my questions after that full, you know, that relate to these things is no, not right now.
Yeah, and so I feel like I'm commandeering your meeting, and I'm sorry. I'm going to make a quick statement. You know, early childhood education, what we've done as staff here is we've done sort of a needs assessment. How many kids, so like for me, I look at Kindergarten 3+, which is a program for kindergarten through third grade students, and say how many students are out there that qualify, how many students are we serving, what do we, and then make a recommendation to, if we needed to get here, here's the amount of money we would need to put in.
Right.
When I look at the first now therefore on page 2, to study the feasibility of fully funding the formula for adult education programs. If you go, and I can send you guys all a link to LFC's Volume 3, we've got a big chart with early childhood education programs that goes through all of those things. Here's what the previous appropriations are. Here's what this year's appropriation is. Here's the amount of kids we think in New Mexico need to be served. Here's who's being served. Here's what they're currently funding at. And we don't make assumptions about whether we're fully funding those or not. Just at the current funding level, how much money would we need to put in to fully fund this? And I think if you sort of think about this in those terms, it may be helpful, because we're, you know, the feasibility, there's a lot of adults out there that need adult basic education services. How do we quantify that? And then, go ahead.
No, I wanted you to finish that, because there's another kink when you talk about K through 3 that I would like to bring up to you when you're done with this part.
Okay, and I mean, I use that as an example of sort of what we've done as staff to show the need. And when I read, you know, study the feasibility of fully funding the formula for adult education programs, well, to me, fully funding means two things. How do we adequately fund programs to effectively provide adult basic education services? And how do we fund everybody who shows up at the door? Not necessarily every New Mexican, because you're going to have an uptake rate that is not 100%, but how do we not have space limited in terms of what this question asks?
Right.
We're not going to be able to fully fund it, but so once you know the funding need, then do you present a plan that, you know, if the legislature could appropriate X amount of increase every year, we think we could serve, you know, all of these students in the next 10 years or the next 5 years or the next 2 years, you know, whatever that time period is.
Okay.
And so it's all dependent on, you know, figuring out what you think the uptake rate will be. How many people do you think you can serve or will show up to be served? not necessarily taking into consideration current resources. What are the resources you need to put into it, and if it's not fully funded per student right now, what does it look like if it's fully funded per student, and sort of calculate that out.
Okay. And when you brought up K3, it made me realize that this is not, and the students, the needs we're not serving now. We in the adult education community are very conscious that the education of the parents of those K3 students,
Yeah, it's huge.
relates directly to their success in the future. Yep. And we're also conscious of the fact that the issues we have at the other end with necessary remediation at the college level are issues we could address more inexpensively than the colleges can.
Right.
And so there's all those little relationships, but I don't know that they have a place in this report.
Well, they might in terms of, throw a bullet or two in, but I will tell you what Rick is in, what Representative Miera is interested in is, so he's concerned. When you look at the amount of funding that is given per student, it's relatively, what is it? It's like $275 per student, per adult in adult basic ed.
In cash, yeah.
The flop side of that is public education funding per student is, I think it's right around $7,000 per student. So, you clearly don't want to make it half of that. You don't want to make it, at some point, these are adults who have, some of them, and a lot of them have gone through some of that public education system and have chosen not to avail themselves of that education, but $275 is probably not enough to do an effective, good job.
Well,
so,
I would also say that it's almost 100% of them were failed at some point by our K-12 system. They just don't come to us the year after they drop out.
Right.
Right. And it may not always have been their choice. In fact, often wasn't.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I don't mean to make a judgment call on.
I know.
And on why they're in adult basic ed. They're there. That's great. They've showed up. I don't think the legislature is going to be interested in saying, okay, we think $3,000 per student is reasonable. Maybe they will, but given that we're at $275 or $300 a student now, you have to think about what's going to look reasonable to the legislature in terms of an increase also. They've asked you for data, you need to give them data, but try to be as thoughtful as you can in terms of if you come in with a request that says, well, right now you're giving us $300 and we want $1,500, a 500% increase. Somebody's going to raise their eyebrows and wonder,
Yeah, and the question also is, we realize that should the legislature decide to somehow fully fund adult education, the funding has to come from somewhere, and you're helping us move on to the next thing about should we even address possible sources. Because I know within the adult education community there's some discussion about having some funding, some PED per student funding reallocated to adult education based on the dropout rate for the preceding year or something. There's been talk about that, but that's just adult educators talking.
Yeah, and so the political viability of that is probably slim to none.
Right.
You've got 2 pending lawsuits right now alleging there's not sufficient funding for K-12 students. You've got charter schools that are targeting your population. You've got several charter schools in Albuquerque and Las Cruces that are specifically opening up to go out and target adult dropouts to go back and get their high school diplomas. I don't, you know, we've sort of toyed around with and talked about, you know, so I'm not sure K-12 is the appropriate place to be providing that. That really should be your guys. If we shifted some of the funding that goes with those students to adult basic ed, because and shift those students to you, I know that's been talked about, but I haven't, you know, clearly with legislators, I don't think given the political climate and the lawsuits that reprioritizing some of the public ed funding based on outcomes there to adult basic ed is really going to materialize.
Okay, and the other thing you need to know that floats around the adult ed community is a discussion about could we reorganize our whole adult system so that we all become charter schools.
Yeah,
But that's
I know that's out there.
That's politically very weird.
Yeah, and I get it. You guys are getting $300. Somebody else is out there serving sort of the same demographic and getting $6,900 or $7,000 a student. I understand. I think this is timely in terms of doing this report and making these recommendations. And I mean, I think really the recommendation should probably be that you guys are the appropriate group. K-12 funding for, you know, qualified children shouldn't, that we have a constitutional obligation to fund, really shouldn't be diverted, shouldn't be funding that demographic. You guys should be doing it, and we should think about what that looks like and having enough money to do it adequately and effectively.
Okay. So that is the only way in which we should address possible sources of funding, which is to suggest that we take full charge of adults and that the state not divert taxpayer money meant for the K-12 people who have that constitutional right to adults. Right?
I think so.
Okay.
I mean, as revenues grow, presumably your appropriations are going to grow, and I mean, I don't think making a recommendation to take from the public ed stuff, I don't think it'll go anywhere. So
right.
I don't. You know, you can put it in a report, but if you're trying to give legislators something that you think they can work with, that's not helpful.
Okay.
I get what you're saying. I understand it. I'm not saying it's a bad idea. I don't think there's any political will.
And we do want to give them something they can work with, period. Mm-hmm. Because,
right.
I mean, we also do not spend a lot of energy in our community blaming K-12 for our problems either. Right. You know, because that's a pointless conversation.
Yeah.
You know?
Yep.
So, okay. So that's the only way we should address funding, is to suggest that we be funded to take care of the adults, and that the funding not be diverted to adults from.
Yeah, and I mean, I think so. You can think about funding in several different ways. You know, you come up with this number, this estimate based on how many folks out there you think would avail themselves of adult basic ed services, and what an appropriate funding level to do that looks like. And maybe it's, you know, you have a 5 or an 8-year phase-in, or you think about how we've rolled in some of these other programs. They target low socioeconomic status families, and so maybe you set up if we're talking about funding needed, how do you phase in? You know, you can't grow your programs threefold overnight. We've seen that with childcare and with some of the CYFD stuff. They're having a problem getting money out the door as we give them more money. It's, you know, it takes time to build the infrastructure and get the folks in place that they need. So I think in terms of funding, if you think about, I think the Early Childhood Development Partnership has done an estimate of here's the dollars we think we need for early childhood education. If you rolled it in over 5 years, here's what it looks like for each one of these programs.
Okay, great.
So maybe it's get to an appropriate level of funding for who we are currently serving in year 1, and then it's grow funding each year after that to serve more than we're currently serving.
Yeah, Frances, I think that's exactly what the memorial was meant for, at least according to Pam Etre Perez. It really was meant to start with what we need where we're at, and then how do we grow our programs. I think that's exactly what the memorial is meant to do.
Okay, so I'm just loving this clarity, and Rachel, I don't want you to feel like you're dominating. You have a lot more information than many of us do, you know. I do want, though, other people like Mona Lee, you haven't weighed in. You know, if people have different ideas or other ideas, really please.
Yeah, I'm sorry, and I am playing a little catch-up, but I definitely want to support what Terry just stated, and I think that's absolutely right about the wording of the memorial. And as we've been talking, I have that old report, Frances, that you had participated in 2010. Do you recall, from the MPR Associates for the funding recommendations?
I recall that.
Yeah, it's quite an extensive document. So
I don't even remember the report. Could you arrange for me to see that?
Yes, I will.
And also, Rachel, please do not forget to send a link about the K3 thing.
I'll do that now as we're talking.
Thanks.
The early childhood stuff.
Yeah. So Mona Lee, that would be helpful to look at what we were thinking then. Because
in that plan, they were also trying to outline the increasing funding as the population grew that we served, just like Terry had mentioned about our memorial. So,
and I want to point, just for people who don't know, the series of events that Mona Lee is talking about is we got a grant to hire adult education funding formula expertise to help us when we were deciding to begin or whether or not to begin performance-based funding. So that is an outcome of that series of events, of work we did then. And I know that whatever it says, because I haven't seen it since then, it's probably the foundation of how we're now thinking a lot.
Well, it is, because it also gives a lot of definition to some of the terms that we need to consider. You know, the FTE, what is that based on, et cetera. So I think it is a very good funding base. But Rachel, you and I, we've not met, and I'd never spoken with you before, but one of the things I just wanted to quickly point out is I think in this whole scenario, one of the issues, did we lose someone?
No, go ahead.
Mona Lee.
Okay. Do you think I can continue?
Go ahead, Mona.
Okay. All right. Is that so many of our ABE programs, like my own, who are in community college my institution provides, you know, $60,000 plus in not in-kind services, but in actual monies towards the salaries of my people. And so, you know, does that hurt when we report that to the legislators, or, you know, does that assist them? Because the numbers would, you know, we're talking about, well, if PED gives 7,000 and we give 275, your recommendation was we not go, you know, overboard on our recommendation. But in actual fact, we are so underfunded, it's shocking.
And I will say,
and I can't disagree with you on that last statement.
Okay.
And I don't mean to insinuate that the memorial calls for, you know, tell us what a fully funded formula for adult education program looks like. So what does fully funded mean? And so my expertise is in public education. So I sort of go back to public education and early childhood as it's my resting state, and so it's what I can talk to you about, what I know. And we did a funding formula study. AIR did a funding formula study for public ed back in 2006, 7, and 8, and they came out with a recommendation. What's it cost to fully fund public ed? And they said, well, we need $348 million new money. And it was based on this like pie in the sky. They put professional judgment panels together and said, what do you think you need to have the perfect educational program? And then calculated out what that looked like. Their initial recommendation was almost $1 billion. Wow. They scaled it back to 358, and some of those requests weren't reasonable. So I think what I mean in saying think about, what fully funded means is don't go out looking for, the Porsche of adult basic ed programs. Keep what you think the fully funded is to something that's reasonable. Otherwise, and I'm not saying you guys wouldn't do that. I say that as a recommendation.
Oh no, I totally understand that, and I like the analogy because right now the funding is supporting a bicycle, and maybe we can get to, I don't know,
a moped.
Yes.
Something with a 50cc engine.
Yes, exactly.
So I'm going to send right now to the group volume 3. It's on page 67. So I've sent you an internet link. That's got the early childhood table we've put together. And it may be helpful, it may not, but I just think in terms of showing people here's the money we think we need. Thinking about it like that.
Thank you so much. That's what we don't know, is how to think about it in a way that can be supported by the political will, and that's the kind of, that's what we need. Thank you.
Yeah, Francis, I think if we can definitively state, as Mona Lee said, if we can state what additional costs it takes, like I know that Judy up at Taos has to raise an enormous amount of money from the outside to keep her program running. Just those costs.
Yeah, 40%.
Yeah, Catholic Charities has to raise, we raise about $200,000 a year in additional monies to run our program over and above what we receive. So we know that that everybody has to, and a lot of us have been scaling back our programs because the money was going down.
Right.
Right.
So looking at what it would take
to
currently fund these programs right now, as we are in full, I think is very important.
Well, we could look at the funding that we received in 2010 and what we did with that, because we could call that fully funded. It was 6.7 million instead of 5.1.
Right.
We could just compare that. There are lots of things we can do. I think it's and those are all informational, and I'm.
Can I ask a question? With your matching funding that you guys are raising, do you think you have a fully funded program, or do you think you still need more?
Oh no, we need more because everyone's at a point, even with the money that they raise or the money they receive from their colleges, they're still trying to determine, okay, can I afford a full-time teacher? No, I'm going to have to, get 2 part-time teachers who probably won't be quite as well trained and probably won't have what we need to have a quality programming, and that's something that everyone takes into consideration.
Right. Yeah, I mean, I think so. If you think you were fully funded in 2010 and you weren't having the same issues, it might be a good benchmark. Not necessarily that $6.7 million equals fully funded, but here's what we need per student. How many students do you, I mean, right now we can cut students back and have a fully funded program, but we're not meeting the needs of the communities.
Right.
So I
Right.
think you've got two sort of moving parts there. How much do we need per student?
Right.
Francis, this is Loretta. I was looking at some of the annual reports, and it looks like we have cost per students on what the programs submit on an annual basis. Now, I know that's not full funding. I know that's just the math. But could we use that as a data point and then look at what the additional needs are if we were to add adequate instructional materials, professional development, and develop that average cost per student, and then use that to
we can
establish
certainly
needs?
do that. But
except you guys, doesn't that number, isn't that only federal and state money? That average cost per student is only those two numbers, so it doesn't include any additional monies programs bring in.
Terry is correct about that.
Yes, it doesn't, and we could, but still the computation, we could make it and include that other stuff.
Right. I'm looking at C&M's contribution cash, and we're about 25% of our program is cash contribution, not including our in-kind facilities and other things like that also.
Yeah.
So I agree.
You need to know that the way the feds do their accounting, your institution's cash contributions in terms of things like salary and that sort of stuff counts to them as in-kind.
Okay.
So, but that doesn't matter. I mean,
So the cost of the program.
The calculation we can do that calculation, and we do to some extent on the fact sheet that we do annually. There's one, the latest one's on the website somewhere now. We do state funding, and you're right, that's under $300 per student. Federal funding, which is less than that, and we compute from the cost surveys the contributions from everybody else, every place else that we know about from the cost surveys, which amounts to almost the total of federal and state cash, and we still come up with less than $1,000 per student.
So is it roughly, we're under $1,000 per adult, likely?
Yes. However, that computation does not include grant funding that our programs get. Some don't get any, and some, like the UNM Taos one, supports itself about 40% on grant funding, and then our community-based organizations, of course, do a whole lot of that too. So we could also include that. You know, I think we need to include everything.
Yeah, and I also think you don't necessarily. Yes, you need to include it all, but
we
you
need
also
to differentiate it.
You need to differentiate it, and you also need to let the legislature know that we don't necessarily want you supplanting some of these other dollars we're getting. We're not going to tell you we think you should be responsible for these dollars and more. Mm-hmm. But you know, we'll continue. I think, you know, universities are spending some money. Private philanthropic groups are probably doing grant funding. You're doing in-kind stuff. That stuff, the intent is to continue with those efforts, but to supplement with increased general fund appropriations.
Right, and the other piece that I didn't mention in this agenda, but I think we talked about before, is that back in 2010, when that report was done and when we developed our first of a series of performance-based funding approaches, that was with 5% performance, we did not anticipate losing funds. And when you have performance-based funding, the way we do it in adult education, because we get no new money, makes it a zero-sum game, and so that our programs basically must cannibalize each other. You know, when Terry's program improves, it does well, and Mona Lee's does even better, Terry's going to lose money, even though she did better this year than last year. because we got to support Mona Lee's doing even better. It's kind of a cannibalistic approach in a field that we thrive on collaboration, you know, and it's very difficult. And I just want to say something, Rachel. I cannot believe how wonderful all those program directors are when we talk about funding formula. They are so good at thinking of the state as a whole.
Yeah.
And rather than advocating for their own programs, which they all really need to advocate for their own programs too, you know.
Sure.
So,
and so as HED and the overseer of these sub-grants from the state funding, you might think about, and I don't know if you do an RFI and RFP or how you get those dollars out and what those contracts look like, but as we move forward and legislators are wanting to know, you know, what are we spending on adult basic education programs per student, collecting some of that data and having as a requirement of the RFP or the contracts that you report any funding, any in-kind, any, so that you have a clearer picture from each of your sub-grantees.
yeah, and we're getting better at that. We now require them to every year do that cost survey. We have not yet required that they tell us all their grant monies, but I think we need to do that too. And as much as it's burdensome to these programs, they're good at reporting on what we ask them to.
They are, but Francis,
they do it.
There's one problem with it that I've heard from several directors, is that there's a huge fear that if they honestly report everything that they bring in to make their programs work, that somehow the state will say, well, then that's what should be your MOE, and not worry about increasing amounts for adult ed, because obviously they can bring it in other ways. I mean, there's a real fear that that's what will be the attitude.
I will tell you that the state office is not going to do that, because for us to start counting everything and reporting to the feds everything as MOE puts us at huge risk of having no fallback. Should funding get cut by the state, there's nothing else we can report. If we've been reporting all of that in-kind stuff that we didn't have to report, we don't report it, you know. And the reason we don't is because, as it turned out, we actually need to report a little portion of it now to keep our federal funding.
But is concern more that state funding will stay stagnant if you guys start reporting all of it, that policymakers will say, well, look, it's really not $275 you're getting a student for these programs. It's $1,500 a student if you count everything in. Why aren't you making that work?
That's the fear. That's the fear.
So I know that there's, you know, we're doing this adult basic education evaluation, and Nathan is there and he's working on the project, and we can't really talk about that, but part of the push to do this the push to do this evaluation came from Tracy and I, saying, you know, we need to do this. As an economic argument, we know that if you don't educate adults, kids grow up in poverty. You sort of have this cycle, and if you can get some of these adults to an employable status, hopefully they can, you know, that trickles down, and you start addressing some of the low performance you see in public schools. You start addressing unemployment. You address all of those things. I think legislators are also interested in this. You know, I think Senator Befford is extremely interested. There's folks on our committee. I know that Mira won't be around anymore as a legislator, but he's extremely interested. He's active in the juvenile justice community. You know, he's not going to disappear completely, I assume.
Right.
I think there's enough people sort of interested in, are we doing what we should be doing for who we're serving now, and if we're not, what does it look like, and then how do we get those people that we're not? Because if we don't, some of these other issues aren't going to just take care of themselves. So I understand the fear, but I think there's enough, from what I've seen, enough legislators out there that are really interested in making sure we're doing this right, that that interest will stay there.
I think so too, and I think that one of Rick Mieta's major contributions has been to make adult education increasingly visible every year. And no one can be politically opposed to it, you know, when we talk about political will. But the issue is having the legislators know as much as possible about it too. Because, see, Terry,
otherwise it comes out in a bad light. You know, you guys are only reporting X, but what about all this other stuff, and why aren't you open? And that's sort of the flop side of that.
That's why we started in our fact sheet reporting even the in-kind contributions when we computed the return on investment, so that, you know, there's a real number there. And I do believe that, I think that transparency from me at the state office about everything is important. It's critical, because then they know that what they're getting in terms of information from us is everything we have. And the way we have to do that is say, yeah, but for example, you know, Judy has to spend too much of her time getting grants at Taos and not enough designing innovations so that our students can do better, things like that, you know. But still, you know, even if we report every penny, it's going to be, I believe, but I'll have to look into it and really compute it, but I think even if we include all the grants, it's going to come out to not much more than $1,000 per student required on the average, or spent on the average, including in-kind contributions of $9 million a year, federal and state contributions.
Other grants. So have you guys done any research on, you know, national comparisons and look to see, there's got to be data out there, you know, somebody's running an adult basic education program that's fully funded and achieving outcomes.
Okay.
Yes. I say that somebody has to be. That
yeah,
might
they
be
are.
Stuff to put in this too. You know, you put in there, you know, when you're making the argument for full funding, national research shows a fully funded adult basic education program costs X per student, or, you know, however it's laid out, and that might be something you want to think about including in your report.
Okay, and I don't know if that's of interest to you in your evaluation of ABE, but that I think I showed you that data. Those data are available at the OVE NRS website, and I can give you two different ways to look at it and ask what you think of those. One is, and these are both states that outperform us, okay, in terms of the National Reporting System measures, performance measures. One is Minnesota, which is their maintenance of effort funding is, I forgot exactly how much, 12 or 1,500% of the federal funding, so that when we got hit with sequestration cuts, all of us, they didn't care. It was like a drop in the bucket, and they outperform us. And then another example that's kind of a little different to look at is Arizona, which is a neighboring state with a similar demographic. And so their federal funding, they have roughly 3 times the state population, and because we have similar demographics, they have about 3 times the federal funding that we get. Their state legislature only contributes about what ours does, around $5 million. But that means that they have like 3 times the funding. I forgot, you know, mathematically, whatever it means. They have more funding, and they serve fewer students than we do. And they have a, what?
They have 3 times the amount of federal funding per student?
No,
Or just
altogether.
their whole grant?
Their whole grant is 3 times the size of ours.
And
They're
they serve
federal.
fewer students?
And they serve about up to 18,000 a year. And they get about the same amount of state money that we do. They get
Gotcha.
about the minimum requirement from the feds of state money. But they serve fewer students, better by NRS measures anyway, and have a state staff of 17 people. We have a state staff when we're staffed of 4. So it's like that's you could also say that's fully funded, you know,
Right.
or define Minnesota as fully funded. So we should do that research. Tina posted, did you see there in the window that the national average of state and federal funding added together is about $1,128 per student on national average.
National average.
And my guess is that if we count, well, I know if we count state and federal, we're well below that.
Right.
And then another...
Her point of those aren't fully funded, or it doesn't necessarily mean they're fully funded, I think is good, but I think those are some good statistics to put in the report. Cite who you're, clearly make sure you're citing good data sources, but it at least like lets policymakers make those comparisons.
Right, so they get the drift about
Francis,
how we are compared.
Francis, this is Lisa from UNM Los Alamos. I sent you some statistical analysis at a federal level on Monday, and I'm going to guess you haven't had a chance to look at it.
I haven't even been in Santa Fe, but I'm going to look at that. I'm very sorry.
That's fine. It might be a starting point.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Can you send that out to the rest?
Ever so much. Yeah, because these kinds of comparisons are useful to us to help the legislators explore the meaning of full funding in New Mexico.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's what Rick wants to know. Representative Mira.
Right.
And others. I say him because he's the sponsor of the memorial.
Of the bill, yeah. And I know that there are others who are beginning to champion adult education a bit. And many others are now conscious of it.
And, internally here as staff, Tracy and Katie, Tracy and Kelly, who does workforce solutions, and early childhood, and so you've got higher ed, public ed, workforce, and CYFD. The 3 of us are really interested in this. So from that level, I think we push stuff up to members. That's good.
Yeah. And may I ask you another question then?
Yeah.
We have this new substitute for the Workforce Investment Act that we call WIOA. And it is going to make some differences in how we operate. And one major difference that will happen is there is a requirement. In the old act, there was a recommendation and an incentive for collaboration between us and Workforce Solutions. And in this state, and in many states, that was ineffective. So what's happened in this act is there's a requirement that I believe, we'll see if it's still there in the final bill, that adult education and Workforce Solutions, instead of making separate state plans for the feds, do a joint plan to ensure collaboration in dealing with this population. And that may be my question is, does the legislature want to know that that's coming up, that there might be, that there's supposed to be a relationship between use of funding to make it more efficient and avoid duplication of effort and all that stuff?
You said that's on the president's desk for signature, correct?
Right, and to know really what we're going to have to do as a result of it, we must await advice from the Department of Education, and there will probably be regulations as well, so we don't know exactly what the practical outcomes will be yet, but we can tell there will be some.
Sure, and I think by the time you've got this report done, you will presumably know that the president has signed that or not and what it looks like, and I don't think it hurts to put information in front of legislators, and I think, you know, we're always interested in breaking down the walls of silos, and here's another way. So you're not duplicating administrative overhead. You've got a cohesive plan. People are all moving in the same direction. I think yes, I think if it happens, it doesn't hurt to note that in sort of an intro or background section.
Okay. And then about the maintenance of effort question, which I know the legislators should fear from a political point of view, and that is that the way the current Workforce Investment Act works, the more they contribute and we report as maintenance of effort funding, the more they have to contribute.
So Francis, is your maintenance of effort provision, is it the state has to make available at least as much as the previous year, and when we make available more, the MOE is set high, at that higher level each year, and it relates back to the high water mark?
Yes, that's how it works, only it's like the 3 preceding years, yeah, but it isn't stated that simply, and it's not just,
okay,
but that's what it is. It's maintaining past effort.
Okay.
I
asked, you know, nobody wants to deal with MOE issues, especially given what's happened with public ed and special ed funding. You know, that's sort of a disaster. And so
I'm thinking we need to reassure them that we can deal with that in a way that doesn't, I mean, we could make it so that they increase our funding a little bit every year depending on whatever they want it depending on, without affecting that. We could do that now under the Workforce Investment Act. I've got to consult with the Office of Career Technical Adult Education to see what they think is going to be the outcome under the new act. Because we could currently, under this act, we could earmark state funding for things like pilot projects and stuff like that that we can't afford to do.
And are those things that count towards MOE, or they don't?
We can arrange to have them earmarked in ways that do not have to be reported as maintenance of effort.
Right.
But that's under current
we talked
act.
about you, Tracy, and I.
Pardon?
I think you, Tracy, and I talked about that maybe last year, and how to report stuff. And I think it's something to address in the report for sure. You know, how do they establish maintenance of effort? What is our maintenance of effort target? What is the level that we have to make available? What things count, what things don't, and make some recommendations to the legislature. If you just have to maintain your maintenance of effort rather than, you know, you don't have to increase it, as we think about, as this group thinks about making recommendations to increase funding, some of that's going to increase our MOE. but are there ways to keep the MOE flat and use other funding sources for those things that would count towards MOE that don't now?
And currently there are ways, and I can't say that those same ways will work under the new act, but
yeah.
I will consult, because the people at Octave will tell me. They're very good about saying, we don't know yet, wait for this, but here's what we're thinking.
Right.
So,
no, I think you don't want it. So some of that is, I mean, how the appropriation is drafted is something the legislature should know if we want to do it that way. If it depends on how you allocate funding, and
yeah.
it's not like dependent on how it's worded in the General Appropriation Act, and it's more an administrative, an HED administrative oversight issue. I'm not sure. More than the statement being, we need to be careful about MOE. If that makes sense.
Yeah,
it does. Depending on who you're making a report to the legislature about things that you think they need to do. If it's stuff that you guys can internally manage, I'm not sure it needs to be a big focus of the report and get people riled up about it.
Right. Okay. So we could say that internally that could be managed. Pretty much. Yeah. Okay.
But I think you probably want to address it in terms of there is a maintenance of effort requirement, so that legislators know. I'm not sure everybody knows. Mm-hmm. Here's what the provision in federal law states. Here's in English what that translates to mean. And here's the amount that here's the FY14, FY15, or FY16 MOE. I guess we'd be at FY15 MOE amount the state has to make available to let people know.
And right now we're beneath the required amount.
So and that might be something worth stating. We are calculating in kind to count towards our MOE currently, because the state's not putting sufficient funding in. I think those are things that you should. I think they're facts.
Yeah. Well, then I have another thing to bring up that I don't know how many people are aware of. Many states take care of their maintenance of effort requirement by making their local subgrants subject to a match from local government or a government-sponsored institution. And that's how they take care of it, is the program doesn't get money unless it can come up with a maintenance of effort match.
And so is your suggestion maybe the state should do that, or it's something to consider?
I think it may be something to consider. I wouldn't recommend it myself unless I first looked at what kind of matches they're already giving.
Right.
And how much we'd like to consider to keep some kind of cushion for ourselves and for them, because I wouldn't want to cause programs to cease and desist just because their agency isn't doing that. And it's also difficult for our CBOs if we do that, because the maintenance of effort funding has to be state or local government. It isn't grants from private entities, And so we have some small CBOs that would be gone if we required a match like that.
Right.
Yeah, which I think is not the purpose. As revenues grow, and this is sort of what we see with public ed funding, we hit that low water mark in FY10 and FY11, and revenues started growing in 12, and they're looking strong now, and they may tank again, they may not. It's hard to, things look good for the future years, especially with gas and oil in New Mexico doing what it's doing. Is it something that needs to be addressed in the report as to how it gets taken care of, or just flagged to folks that there's this requirement? Right now, here's how we're calculating it. I don't know.
Yeah.
Not knowing enough about it.
Well, I think it's
maintenance of effort, because we don't want to put at risk that it's a $5 million grant from the
at
Fed.
this point it's 5. No, it's under 4. Well, it's around 4 and change.
We clearly don't want to lose that, so I think you want to put people on notice that here's what your MOE target is, here's how it's being calculated, here's the amount of state funding that's going to it. We're clearly not meeting it with state funding. Here's some other in-kind stuff that we're counting towards it to make it. I'm not sure if that answered your question.
I think it did. I'm just, I just want, and the other thing I think that I have a question about is one of the most critical things to us is so far with, I mean, we don't have our formula is not a perfect formula, but so far we remain guardedly committed to having a performance-based component, and part of full funding is to ensure that there is, you're acquainted with the HED funding formula, which is they have at-risk and all that, their definitions. We have just what they call something, we don't call it. They call it base, right?
Right.
The part that's not performance-based. We call it core because out of the core we take a base, which we consider to be the minimum necessary to run a tiny program.
Now,
and then the rest. But our at-risk funding needs to have a new money piece to it so that we can stop cannibalizing each other.
Right. Is the adult basic education formula in regulation?
No.
Is there a,
okay.
And I'm not suggesting that you need it. I'm not.
I don't think we do.
That I go back to, reading that adult basic ed statute for the fund, and it states you guys will come up with a formula. And I think as part of this, the legislature doesn't necessarily need to think about a formula. If you guys have a formula that adequately addresses potential legislative concerns, i.e. that performance piece for your subgrantees, then it's really how much money do we need to put in if we're going to grow it over time. And then you guys have the mechanism for pushing the dollars out to your subgrantees.
Right, and I think that now under my jurisdiction, we don't just create a funding formula in the state office. We really do listen to the input of the people in the field.
Right.
My guess is that it would be fine. Well, my guess is that if, say, we got new money over and above our 5.1 million, it would be okay with the people in the field to use the new money for performance or certain performance incentives and let the rest of the money, while it would depend somewhat on performance, help them remain stable so that
right.
It would be more of an incentive than a sink or swim situation, because I just think that economically performance-based funding for our programs in this state is untenable without a pocket of money that people don't have to worry about losing.
Right.
It's only gain.
Francis, if you go back to sort of the beginning of the conversation about, what is full workload? If you define full workload, and you said you'll come back with a few scenarios, if you've got, and I don't understand that term entirely, so keep that in mind with what I'm saying, but if you come back with a recommendation of workload, if the expectation is that there are 40 contact hours, and we're funding people that are showing up for 4 contact hours the same way we're funding people that show up for 40, I think if you play with that piece as well, it takes care of some of the performance on the end, because you're saying, we're not just funding everybody that shows up at the door, we're funding people that meet certain benchmarks in this definition of full workload, more so than funding, I think your idea of, well, let's just take everybody's hours and divide it by 40 and fund based on FTEs. I mean, that's basically saying anybody that shows up to the door, the time they show up for counts regardless of a minimum amount of time. So I think that can sort of balance out that performance piece too.
Okay, so we need to word that like that in some way that points that out.
Yeah, if I understand it correctly. No, I may not.
Well, I don't. We would not. We could not. I think. I think federal law would get us if we counted anybody's hours who showed up for less than 12, because that's what they define as a quote fundable student.
Gotcha.
So they'd have to be at least 12, and then whatever we decide is fundable to us. Now, when we and I got to again give credit to this group of the task force, the funding task force. They solidly backed requiring 40 hours, even though to some of their programs that was not a good idea, Right. But one thing behind that is that the federal government requires us to have a minimum standard for who we will fund at all.
Right.
Now that can be read several ways. One is that we have their standard for fundable student, which is 12 credit hours, or 12 contact hours, which is what we used to do. But part of this decision was that requiring 40 required also a minimum performance standard.
Right.
And that's why we did it, to help protect ourselves from an accusation by the feds that we don't care who we fund.
Right.
So that's just part of why that's there.
Okay. Well, it's just my initial thoughts, not knowing more about this than I do. You look at how we fund some of the public ed in some of these programs, and it's like there's a minimum attendance level in order for a school district to get any funding for some of this stuff. And so I just I go back to that, and part of it is the effectiveness of the appropriation. If you do a cost-benefit analysis and we're funding a ton of students that show up for 3 hours and aren't getting anything, but we're still funding them, your benefit's going to be a whole lot less in the long run. So how do you incentivize programs to keep students in and engaged? And I understand that adults also, we have to make the rent, we have to feed ourselves. There are different
and so, and that's what we're trying to do with that 40-hour requirement.
Right.
Is help incentivize people, and which carries with it the requirement from us at the state that we provide professional development and technical assistance to help them do that.
Right.
you know.
Right, and I mean, you look at what PED is doing now. They've got a lot of money going into professional development to get people, you know, teaching third grade reading, dealing with new content standards that is very professional development rich, and I think we probably can't, you know, we sort of need to have the same expectations that professional development needs to be targeted, it needs to be high quality, and we need to be providing it.
Francis, do we have access to how much PED is spending right now on PD?
I can pull some of that together for you.
It'd be good to make that comparison. That'd be really helpful, actually.
And I want to say that standards are a huge issue for New Mexico adult education, and we're about to begin a project starting in the fall to the adult education equivalent of those standards is college and career readiness standards, to unpack those national generalized standards and repack them in a way that works for New Mexico, which will probably be a 2-year process and will be really professional development intensive. The first part I'm going to be able to get done for nothing for us, which is good. I mean, the expertise will come for Octails pay for it. We will have to pay some other costs like travel, but you know, so we need to also, that's a need we have that's very hard for us to fulfill at this funding level, which is actually creating state standards. We don't have them. We base them on what it takes to make a level gain, or what it takes in terms of content standards, you know, what it takes to make a, to get a GED, but that's really not what standards should be about. We're supposed to be about college preparation or post-secondary preparation, and about, especially about lifelong learning. Because there's now a study that shows that our performance measures in terms of level gains and things like that are fairly meaningless over the long run. This study looked at students regardless of what they achieved or how long it took them to do it, who did 100 hours of adult education and followed them for 10 years, compared to a control group who did not have adult education, and they found that when you go out about 6 years, it makes a huge difference in their lives. You know, and so lifelong learning skills and passion have to be part of our work.
Yeah.
But we do need standards to accomplish that, really.
Yeah.
So,
well, and then
okay.
I wrote down for me to do for you guys, I will try to pull together some PED money spent on professional development. It'll probably be based on FY14 appropriations, with the caveat of we've got this joint LFC and LESC meeting in August. It's 3 full days of education. My primary focus is that, and so it could be a couple of weeks.
Okay.
But it shouldn't take me long if I sit down and do it.
I've got down a big list of things we need to do, and yeah, well, we know what they are. Looking at workload definition options, finding out the costs per student and per program that are differentiated about whether they're in kind and where they come from. Examining the volume 3 of the LFC to just get an idea of your work that you've done on the early childhood things. Look at the stuff Lisa provided talk to the feds about what they see in the future for maintenance of effort requirements and provide some kind of draft. And when I say my office to do all that, I'm meaning I'm going to call on people on the field to help get this stuff together. Does that sound right to...
Excuse me, as you're talking about workload, it might be helpful if you can throw in, you know, what the statewide average is, or if there are national averages on workload too as a comparison.
Right.
Or contact hours. Is there a national average for adult basic ed of what, you know, contacts are? What's the average here in the state of New Mexico for contact hours? Because I think that will give some folks perspective if that data can be collected. If it can't, it can't.
I think the NRS has that.
I'm thinking we can get that. We can get an awful lot from the NRS. Tina just sat out for us real fast, probably using their data about the state plus federal funding average, for example. So how would it be if, together with people who are willing to do some of this research, the state takes the responsibility of doing a draft which takes the form of an outline of what might be in this report? Does that sound reasonable?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yep.
Yes, it does.
Okay.
Francis, are you also going to Francis, are you going to talk with Senator Sapien about getting us onto the September?
Yeah, that's number one on my list, to get us on to one of their hearings with statewide access. That they're both in Santa Fe, is that right? The two with statewide access?
October, November, and December will be in Santa Fe, so they are traveling to Hobbs, New Mexico in September, which is kind of a trek for folks to go to. It's not centrally located, and it probably won't be video cast. If I were you, like I mentioned before everyone was on the phone, I would ask him for November with the understanding that the Legislative Finance Committee will be hearing budgets for higher ed and public ed in December. So it's a good time to, you know, get it out a month before. Tracy and I make staff recommendations to, and Kelly for that matter, staff recommendations for workforce, PED, HED to members in December. And so we could take that information, and you could do it in October, but I think it also gives you a little more time to collect data and have a comprehensive report. Some of the cost stuff might not be as simple to compile in terms of ideally, here's what we would like.
Okay, and I am needing to keep people above me in HED informed about what we do, and we'll have to share any draft, you know, have it pass through whoever they want me to pass it through. So I just want you to know that there's, you know, there will be some issues of political will here.
Sure.
Okay.
There always are.
Yeah.
I also think, and I will talk to David about, you know, while we're providing information, whether or not, you know, when you say recommendations, if they're recommendations of the work group, including LFC staff, or if, you know, we just staffed you, and I need to clarify that for you as well.
Right. So I need to keep it clear here that this is not an HED recommendation.
Well, that it's a work group.
That it's a working group
recommendation.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, for which I am currently just described. Okay.
Sounds good, Francis.
So
Loretta, I would be interested in helping with the costing project, whatever that means. If that means sitting with your staff to look at reports or doing a survey to the programs to see if we can get all the costs kind of grouped together by direct, indirect, and in kind, and then we'll see how we deal with that. I'm happy to help with that.
Thank you so much. I just drew an arrow from Loretta to number 4 on my piece of paper.
Okay. And if I can go and, sit with Michael or whoever to see what you guys already have, the data you already have, then we can see what else we need.
Francis, it's Mona Lee. Concerning what Loretta was just talking about, when we turn in our final annual reports with that cost survey, that timeline would be just perfect for this.
It would. I would like to point out, Mona Lee, that everyone fills those cost surveys out differently. So I think a cost survey would need to be worded differently, because what I notice is some people are putting all funding, some people are only putting bits of funding. It's really, really haphazard. So I think we'd have to be much more direct, or if Loretta were willing to do the survey, is to make sure that people knew exactly what is being looked for.
Yes, and why.
Right.
What we need to do is follow up. At this point, that's what we need to do, is follow up on each one of them.
Right.
And in most agencies, I know that the person who fills it out is not the director of the program. It's often a fiscal person.
Right.
So yeah, so we'll have to follow up on those to ask questions. And
what's the timeline for those the upcoming reporting? Did I see they were due in August or?
August, yeah.
So could that report, could we modify it to include all the information we need for this purpose as well? Or is that a standardized report that you use for Fed reporting or other?
Well, what we could do possibly is send an addendum to it.
Okay.
We could do that. You're right, Mona Lee, that's a good idea. And let people know that we're doing this as part of a report.
Mm-hmm.
To the Legislative Education Study Committee. Is that who we're reporting to?
That's what request you report to, yeah.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, to them.
I think as you think about the outline, I'd set it up with sort of a basic intro section about what adult basic education is, what the goals are, what type of programming you guys do in terms of what are the benchmarks, where are you trying to get students to, is it a GED, is it basic literacy, is it basic numeracy, some statistics about how many people you serve, and just some basic general data so people understand that if they pick it up and read through it, someone that has no idea about adult basic ed.
And you've just made an outline like that?
Me?
Yeah.
I just gave it to you.
Oh, okay.
No, I haven't made one. I said, as you think about the outline,
Yeah.
I think you want to start with sort of some real general, what is adult basic ed? Who does it serve? What do we give these people? Some basic background information, because, while I'm familiar with a little bit with adult basic ed, I don't really know what it is you guys do, what your goals are, and that's my own ignorance, because I don't spend a lot of time dealing with adult basic ed, but I think it'd be good to put that stuff in so somebody off the street that picks the report up can read it and understand everything you're talking about.
Okay, I think I just did one of those. For my agency, the secretary wanted to know, again, what it, and it's a one-page thing. I might kind of see if that's what you're after. It's really basic, but that is important.
Yeah.
Basic is probably best.
Yes, basic's essential.
And keep in mind your readers. Some folks are going to know, this is going to legislators. You're probably likely you're going to give it to LESC, but likely it'll get handed out to others. And some people have a really good idea of what adult basic ed is, some don't. you know, what's a contact hour, what do we expect, and certain just basic things that you talk about, I think you could explain in an intro.
Okay, and this one addressed what we're supposed to do by federal statute, which is a short list of 4 things, and who we serve, and an example of outcomes is what it did. But yeah, something like that, right?
Yeah.
Francis,
be helpful.
looking at the HED website for ABE, the overview and contact information, just the overview is great. It talks about the services, who you serve, what is adult ed. Even some of that information is already there.
Okay. And I just need to take it off, I mean, steal it back away and put it in this.
Yeah.
Okay.
This is Loretta again. I have one question for the program folks. I know in our last meeting we talked about the value of having maybe a higher percentage of full-time faculty or instructors versus adjuncts, and I would just ask, maybe we do this in the survey, what would be that, what's the desire there? What would that look like in an optimum model? Because that would impact costing as well.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I can tell you at Catholic Charities, I know that we have a better program because we have more full-time staff. And as Francis said in the last meeting, almost all best practices include full-time staff.
Right.
But it is expensive.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So if 100% is not a reasonable model, what would be the target? And so that, and we could cost that way, you know, as a best practice as well.
Even,
so just
even funds that would pay adjunct staff for professional development would be helpful.
Okay. And I think we talked about a pot of professional development funds earlier, right?
Yeah.
So just those things to think about, but maybe we can put that in that survey that we're talking about.
I have one other thing to add about that full-time best practices business, and that is that when you have part-time people, even in our profession where people tend to be amazingly dedicated, what happens is they're less stable because they can't afford to be part-time because they don't feel committed to by the institution, all that stuff.
Right.
And there's the cost of replacing people that we sometimes fail to consider. That when a part-time person leaves and we replace them with another part-time person, that person, first of all, we have to find them, which is costly, hire them, which is costly, and train them, which is costly. And then they leave and we do it again. So there's that, the cost of replacement is kind of important, and I don't know quite how to fit that in.
You all, this is Mona Lee, because I do have full-time faculty too, and as the years have progressed, I have actually done away with some of those positions because I found they were less flexible in changing their teaching schedules to reflect the needs of the students. And my part-time faculty, it was much more fluid for them. So there are some, you know.
Yeah. And that's why I'm testing that a mix or a blend, you know, what is that appropriate mix or blend, or does it change by program?
Yeah,
and
exactly.
That's harder to capture, but to think about that would be interesting for this piece as well.
And I do think that probably we would find, if we figured out how to study it, that it would be important not to have only part-time people. But I don't know if that's true.
This is again Lisa from UNMLA. I think how you would want to couch it is a blend that demonstrates the ability for consistency from semester, from year to year, so that you have a core that keeps the curriculum consistent and delivered in a reliable fashion, and that you know you're going to be replacing a certain amount of the part-time staff, but you have the stability backbone to make sure the curriculum is never at risk.
That's exactly how we've restructured ourselves. Yeah, that's a very good point.
And that is where it all begins to relate to the college and career readiness standards, because standards make it easier to do that. So how do we feel like this meeting got us where we need to go this time?
I think there's a lot of good conversation.
Okay, and we have work to do before the next one that will be productive.
I think it's good we have a little extra time to, we have a little more time to do the research and pull together a better report as well if we're not rushing to get this done by August.
I'm sorry I didn't hear that.
I said I appreciate the fact that we have more time to pull a stronger report together.
So do I.
Yeah, friends.
Ideally, that's
to
what
really
we're just going to want is comprehensive, thoughtful, as opposed to, oh my gosh, we need to rush and get this done because there's a deadline on something that carries no force of law. So I think that's the right approach personally.
I heard someone else trying to say something.
Oh, Francis, I was just curious about when do you want to meet for next time?
That's what I'm asking people now.
Okay.
Do we want to give it 2 weeks?
I think that's reasonable.
Okay, so whatever Friday it is 2 weeks from now.
The first. August 1st, anybody?
Yeah, that's fine.
Yep, that's good.
Anybody say no to August 1st?
This
Okay,
is Loretta. I can't participate, but I can try to work on some of the costing stuff and provide it before that.
And we can work together, Loretta.
Okay, yeah, I'm hoping that I can work with you and your staff on that.
Yeah. Thank you,
Francis,
everyone.
this is Lisa again. Do we have a timeline of some way, shape, or form that says a draft by a certain date and a research by a certain date and an outline by a certain date and that kind of just a real structure to what we want to get done over the next 6 weeks?
The structure I see right now is starting at the end. If we get a November meeting with the LESC, and people jump in and correct me when I'm not doing it right, I think they need to have a final report 2 weeks before whenever that meeting is in November.
The meeting in November is scheduled the 17th, 18th, 19th, and 20th.
Okay. So I would say that depending on what day of the week it is, November 1st, we ought to have a final ready.
The 1st is a Saturday.
Okay. How about the Monday after that Saturday? Or would it be better to do it the Friday before?
The
We're not
3rd.
going to do it over the weekend, so give yourself till Monday.
Yeah, okay, great. So November 3rd is the final report. And then going back to the front end, I think that in 2 weeks, on the 1st of August, we should have a fundamental draft in front of us, the basics of data for an appendix or whatever you would call it, and then consider how to begin finalizing the draft and what else needs to be added to the data and all that stuff at the end. I was told that the report itself should only be a couple of pages. Is that wrong? And
who told you that?
Tracy.
Tracy Hartzler?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think you don't. So you can look at other reports. You don't want to limit yourself. You don't want to put so much in there that you know, you need an executive summary to go through it.
Right.
But you also don't want to say, oh my gosh, we're only supposed to do 5 pages, but all of this is important. What can I cut? I wouldn't really make it more than 10.
Okay, so what we will do is we will create some kind of draft for the next meeting that's some few pages long, an amount of pages, and then part of what we decide at the next meeting is what should remain in that and what should go in the appendix and what else needs to be in the body.
Right.
Okay. Does that work for everyone?
Works for me.
Yep.
Yes, that's fine with me too.
Okay.
Yes, works for me.
So we're collecting all the data in the first week or so and then putting together a draft narrative in the next 2 weeks to be available for everybody on August 1st. That's the gist.
A fundamental draft, right, Francis?
Yes.
And all the data collectors will meet and talk to each other and find some time to collect and give and take from each other.
You'll have to do some delegating, Francis, to make sure all the data gets collected.
I do. And I get to do that Monday. Or people can volunteer now. Loretta's already volunteered a whole lot, and I can tell Lisa's going to be working on a lot.
And you know I'll help.
Yep.
And you can just tell me what you need, Francis, and I'll do it.
Wonderful, Molly.
And so, Francis, so you know my schedule. I know I wasn't at the last meeting, and there will be, you know, we will make sure we always have somebody from LFC at the meeting, 1 or 2 of us. I am pretty much out of pocket from August 11th through September 14th.
Okay.
In terms of, I'm out of town that week, August 11th. We've got LFC the next week, and then I leave the country for a couple of weeks.
Oh, good for you.
Where's she going?
Are you coming back?
Well, you'll know on the 14th.
Okay, so we will count on office.
That was
Tracy or Kelly?
Yeah. And I don't mind looking at a report
Yeah.
either, but when you get your draft and sending comments and whatnot as well,
Yeah, okay.
clearly.
Anything else, everybody?
I think it sounds good, Francis.
I feel personally that we got a long ways because we all needed to learn some things from each other and from our different points of reference, you know. It makes me feel more secure about the fact that we're going to get it done and we will be able to do a good job.
Yay.
Yep.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, Francis.
Thank you, guys.
And let me know if you need any additional help on my end. I'll put together some things, some notes. But if you need anything specific, just let me know.
And speaking of that, Tina, any of the stuff that you run into, like your little average you sent us, you know, do it. I mean, I'll be delegating things, but also information will pop up for all of us that seems important.
Yeah, and make sure you include references to sites in the report, but if just in a footnote
Right.
for that data, for that national data stuff.
Absolutely. Yeah, we have to cite every source. Sorry, there's Harley's again. I can't hear you. I don't know if that.
All right, I'm gonna sign off. I've got to get to an 11:30.
Well, thank you very, very much. Thanks.
Thank you guys as well.
Thank you.
Have a great week.
Bye, Rachel.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Francis, it's Munley. Before we sign off, I'm going to scan that document that I was talking about, the 2010 report by the Independent Association, and I'll send it to everybody. I've got the notes from the meetings too, which I think are important because it shows and defines some definitions. That's about 50 pages, but I'll put it in a PDF and send it email through everybody.
Thank you.
And I have no idea where I got it.
Well, I have no idea why I haven't seen it here.
Okay.
You know, hanging around.
It's good somebody's got it.
Yeah.
I'm sorry I missed the last meeting, guys. I must say I was on vacation, so.
It's okay, Molly. Never apologize for vacation.
I must say, yeah, that's a brilliant place to be. And thank you so much for helping, Mona Lee.
Oh, no, my pleasure. All right, I'm going to sign off now. Thanks, everyone, and I'll see you on the 1st.
Okay, behave yourself.
Bye-bye. No, never.
Is this the rest of us signing off then?
There's still 5 of us here.
Really? Who's still here? Well, 4 of us in here, right?
Well, I'm saying goodbye, so maybe the webinar is ending.
Okay. Talk to you later.
Thank you all very much.
Okay.
Yeah, bye-bye.
So I'll let you. Okay. Whoops. All right. Thanks. Thank
And
you
I
both
will
for
definitely
coming.
remind
For
Francis
participating. You know, it's huge to have you guys on board.
It's rough because I can right? Say much, but I do learn a lot.
But if you're learning, and then we're learning from you guys. I mean, the things I've heard from Rachel, it's like, wow, okay, that's good to know.
And we'll be able to probably put a lot more into the report than you guys will, and it'll be a lot of the same stuff because we just have a much more narrow scope. So, I mean, broad scope. So, I think, yeah, it's definitely helpful that we're kind of working together.
I think it's fabulous. I think it's great, yeah.
And then I'm glad that you guys are, that it's not going to be until November.
Yeah, we were worried that it would have to be given by August, and it was like we got such a late start that we wouldn't have gotten all this done.
Yeah, and we tried to tell Francis this a month ago.
Yeah. Sometimes you're never sure, though, what's a mandate and what's, you know, we actually take the legislature seriously. I'm sure most people don't. It doesn't sound like if most memorials don't get. Well, I know like the Hispanic Education Act, there's a lot happening around that right now, even though that was passed in 2010, and nothing happened for a while. So.
And it'll be nice because we're presenting to LFC in October, and then I think LSC wanted us to